Hi everyone. In this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about mixed methods research. So the plan for the lecture, we'll begin by talking a little bit about qualitative and quantitative research and review. We'll talk about mixed methods research in general, and finally we'll wrap up by talking a little bit about the practice of mixed methods research. So let's begin by reviewing quantitative and qualitative research. So this is our kind of stylized list of what you might call elective affinities that are things that are oftentimes associated with quantitative and qualitative research, but none of which is simply a kind of binary, got a binary association with the one or the other. So quantitative research is often characterized by statistical analysis, generally a more structuralist ontology, positivist tendencies, deductive testing of theory approach. It's primarily, again, this is sort of the stereotype, interested in causal relationships between variables, and it's characterized by a large N and probability sampling. Qualitative research, by contrast, is oftentimes associated with logical analysis, a generally more constructivist ontology, what you might call interpretivist tendencies, an inductive approach that's concerned with the generation rather than the testing of theory. It's primarily interested in social meanings and processes, and it's characterized by a small N or sample size and purposive sampling. So these are some of the kind of, you can almost think about it as a cloud of terms that circulate around this sort of planet known as quantitative or qualitative research, even though those terms in themselves are somewhat hard to pin down. We've already talked about that in some detail before. So when you see definitions outside of this class or outside of a context where people are trying to pick them apart carefully, again, as we've noted before, you'll almost always see something like this. So for instance, a definition of qualitative analysis might go something like the use of non-numerical data, words and images, to gain an in-depth contextual understanding of social phenomena. That's a definition that I pulled from a syllabus for a different instructor at a different university. But you can kind of see the point here that the kind of standard definition is typically concerned with delineating sort of numeric and non-numeric analysis and putting up a really hard, fast line between qualitative and quantitative research. I'm not a big fan of this type of definition. We'll talk a little bit about some of the problems with it that we've already seen a number of times in just a moment, but that's, again, a way to think about what this is on a sort of basic level. Maybe somewhat more reliably, typically what people mean by qualitative analysis also, if you think about the actual craft of the analysis, is things like ethnographic or participant observation, semi-structured interviews, focus group discussions, interpretive analysis of texts, and so on. So this is maybe a more defensible definition, but it's important to pin down what exactly we mean by this. So let's start by talking about some of those problems just one more time with the conventional definition of qualitative and quantitative research. So if you're doing qualitative research, for instance, and you're thinking in your head, well, qualitative research means I'm going to avoid any kind of numbers. I don't want to deal with those. Those are sort of artificial confinings of human life and the rich music of social interaction to just a single box. Maybe that's the approach that some qualitative researchers take. But what if, for example, your interviewees frequently talk about numbers? So you might interview a union official who talks about unemployment rates or the rates at which people are joining or leaving the union. You might interview a supply chain manager who's talking about inflation. These are common circumstances. So regular people care and think a lot about relative frequencies in their lives. So if nothing else, some of the words that you might analyze would be words that refer to numbers. What if the subjective appraisals of reality among your interviewees don't agree? So if 9 interviewees say that something happened and one says that it didn't, how do you weight their interviews? And really, in the first place, even noticing this phenomenon, which everyone naturally does, is a form of numeric thinking. So there's really no way around thinking about frequencies or thinking about things in a minimally numeric sense in human life. Almost everyone sort of above a minimum cognitive ability finds himself making this kind of judgment all the time. It's just that we tend to make it so naturally in situations that concern us that it's oftentimes hard to spot, and then it feels like in other scenarios, oh, well, now I'm turning on this numeric thinking cap. But really, most people do this pretty naturally when it's a topic that's of interest to them. They start thinking numerically. Finally, your qualitative interpretation of interviews also depends to some extent on the relative commonness of subjects' views and actions. So this is in a way what I was saying above, that when you try to think about how you weight different opinions, how you contextualize people, and what they're thinking. You need some sense of how common or uncommon those views are, regardless of whether or not you think they're true or false. It's not like you're trying to say that just because it's common it's correct, or because it's common it's incorrect, but this is more about trying to make sense of people, and to decide whether someone's a limit case or a representative case requires that you have some grasp of how common their views are. Okay, so all of that said, is there anything at all to this distinction? I would argue yes. Most people intuitively recognize that doing statistical analysis on numeric data gathered through surveys differs in key ways from something like ethnography, but the question is in what way? And again, to review this one more time, this is a slide I've shown before. There's different ways to think about this, but here's my opinion on this as someone that's done a fair amount of both types of research and has a maybe heterodox view, but one that I think is one that gets to the heart of the matter. I would say that all qualitative studies involve basic numeric analysis, right? And many, in fact, almost all quantitative studies require a survey instrument where the exact nature of the question wording matters. This is not as true of big data, but generally speaking, words matter in quantitative analysis, numbers matter in qualitative analysis. So what does the distinction actually mean? I would say that it's something like this. Quantitative data are secondhand, so there's relatively little free response. The goal is to keep the number of possible responses small, meaning that you are trying to limit subjects' responses to certain forms. And by the way, this doesn't necessarily mean that you're trying to restrict the range of numbers, for example, but that you're trying to force people to give you a real number instead of a string of words. So a given quantity of data, if you think about this as almost like a three-dimensional volume of data, it's going to have a relatively large number of rows, relatively small number of columns, and then within sort of each cell or stretching above the cell, again, you don't maybe even want to think about it as a small number of possible responses, but almost like a restricted framework for responses. So you can only put in a number, for example. Qualitative data, by contrast, are often firsthand. The goal is typically to avoid reducing the range of responses, and a given quantity of data has a small number of rows, a large number of columns, as it were, or variables, and close to any possible response is allowable for qualitative data. So those would be the key differences. It really has to do with not so much, again, the presence or absence of numbers, but whether or not you restrict responses to a specific type of format with the goal of producing a specific type of data set. So this ends up looking pretty similar to that traditional distinction as we've seen before, but I don't want you to walk away thinking that it's as simple as numbers versus words. That would be I think, fairly catastrophic oversimplification. The difference is really that when we have people's own words, we tend to have few observations that are not an unbiased sample. Those things don't necessarily all mutually imply one another, but that's just the way that these things tend to turn out. And when we have large observations that are carefully chosen in a way that makes them representative, we usually need to use form responses. We'll note this week, actually, that with big data, we sometimes have a combination of these two types of things. We have large quantities of people's own writing, which we can actually use some basic mathematical techniques on. And this is a case where the distinction can get really blurry. But until the advent of computer records and also the internet, to be honest, so not just computerization of records, but the internet, and then also kind of methods in machine learning that have only recently been developed in the last 10 or 15 years, has it been possible to combine large samples of people's firsthand discussion of their lives in a way that can be where we have lots of different observations and we can do statistical analysis on them. But that's basically what machine learning is, and it's a very exciting field. So let's now talk, though, of kind of going backwards a little bit about some of the strengths of quantitative analysis. Then we'll talk about some of the weaknesses. We'll do the same for qualitative analysis. Then we'll talk about combining the two. So what are the strengths of quantitative analysis? Well, there's no perfect summary statistic for quantitative data. We can usually use comparable summary statistics with a fixed meaning under ideal circumstances. For example, we can calculate the mean of income for this group and that group and be relatively certain that we're comparing like with like, at least to an extent. Maybe these different groups have different cost of living, or maybe these groups have different ways of spending their money, but the social meaning of money is, generally speaking, relatively constant, right? It buys the same amount of goods and services. In most places in, say, a single country, Not always with respect to all types of goods, and you have to think about super atypical places. So, comparing a packet of income in, let's say, Rapid City, South Dakota versus New York City, you're going to have to make some adjustments there. But most places in most parts of the United States, for instance, at any given point in time, you can roughly compare dollar incomes. It's also relatively easy with quantitative analysis to produce a plausible range of values for the population parameter, which is, again, the value that we really care about, so something like mean household income for Wisconsin, thanks to the theory of sampling distributions, which we've talked about quite a bit. This also requires us to follow a fairly careful set of rules for sampling, but this isn't such a bad thing. The fact that there are clear rules can be reassuring. And the other nice thing, too, about quantitative analysis is that it's typically possible to simulate a randomized controlled trial, those which allow us to infer some degree of causality, by parceling out the effect on y of some xj, so some particular causal variable, net of some vector of controlled covariates x. So that could be things like, let's say we're interested in the effect of education on income and we want to control for race, class, and gender, something like that. That's generally speaking, although it's difficult to do well, it's a setup that quantitative analysis is well suited for. So what are some of the weaknesses of quantitative analysis? Well, we're strongly limited by how good the questionnaire is, whether we write it or someone else does. We kind of get one shot. It's very expensive to administer surveys. If you do it wrong the first time, you're kind of up S Creek. Or if you get someone else's survey data and they aren't fit for purpose, then once again, you really can't do much about it. There's rarely much opportunity to modify this using a purely quantitative strategy. It's also difficult to claim causality without observing the particular mechanism. So while education might be associated with higher income net of other factors, we might want to know how that actually happens. And generally speaking, quantitative analysis is far from ideal for this kind of observation. There are also just intrinsically some types of information that are difficult to compress into numbers. So things like people's feelings, sometimes the nature of situations where we really think two things mutually cause one another, or they're difficult to pull apart into separate discrete properties of reality. Kind of in a way like, sometimes it's meaningful to talk about, say, the dimensions of a physical object, and you can treat the dimensions as separate, even though all objects in reality are three-dimensional. But there are other situations where that may not make very much sense, especially in social situations. Finally, it's pretty tough to avoid various types of bias in sampling. That's actually really hard to do. Selecting a random group of people is relatively easy, but getting them to respond, especially getting them to respond to every single question, is generally pretty hard. Wanted to show you here some basic data. I haven't shown you any original quantitative data in a little while, but I wanted to put up this set of numbers here. This is a two-way table, which is not something that we had time to talk about in our class, but you can see in this two-way table, I cross-tabulated respondents' highest degree of education on the rows, and then their father's highest degree of education on the columns. This is from the GSS 2018. Notice that the GSS 2018 did not have any non-responses to respondents' highest degree of education. So people had to answer this or else their surveys were basically omitted, or the person was considered entirely non-responsive. However, plenty of people gave their own highest degree, but did not give their father's highest degree of education. And actually what you can see here is people who answered don't know, inappropriate, or not applicable. These were much higher for people that had less than high school education. They, in some way, didn't give their father's level of education at a rate of, gosh, this is going to add up here to something like, 38%, somewhere around there. Whereas people that had a graduate degree, it was maybe 13 and change here who didn't respond to it. So rates of non-response, for instance, to specific questions, which is called item non-response and is actually a really big deal, were highest among people who were, say, socially marginal. It wasn't random. We could easily predict who wasn't going to respond with higher probability to the father's highest degree of education question. It was people who had little education themselves. Okay, so that's just an important point to note. Now let's turn and talk about the strengths of qualitative analysis, then we'll talk about the weaknesses. So among the strengths of qualitative analysis would be that we allow subjects to use their own words, at least filtered to varying degrees by the researcher. That is, we're generally more flexible about the types of response that we'll get. We also, generally speaking, get to observe concrete social interactions, at least in the case of ethnography. So we can see people's interactions nice and up close. It's also generally easier to update the research query. So some specific set of questions or prompts can be modified as we go along doing the research because the research tends to happen over extended periods of time rather than all at once. It's also less important to have the same set of questions for every single respondent. Qualitative analysis also, at least ostensibly, has the opportunity to be more collaborative because the researcher actually gets to know their subjects, and indeed that might well be a beneficial thing about qualitative analysis or something that's desired. But there are some weaknesses, inevitably. So first of all, the question of whether our sample is fair or not is a nagging one. Even if the purpose is to observe a mechanism and we purposely choose a biased sample to see it in its pure form, it might be unclear how different most people are to that sample. And again, I think we've seen a number of articles. I'm not assigning you bad qualitative articles on purpose or something. I'm assigning you the best of the best. But this remains a sort of problem with a lot of qualitative analysis is there's a lot of hand-waving about whether or not the sample is characteristic of the population. And it seems like in every situation, even if we say, well, we think this sample is atypical, but we think it's the kind of most extreme expression of a particular phenomenon, you have to account for how you believe that to be true and why you believe that to be true. And a lot of qualitative researchers, I think, generally speaking, don't account for the fact that even if you say, well, we don't care about representation or like a sample being exactly characteristic of the whole population, we want it to really bring out something that is like, this is the purest form of the phenomenon. The problem is you still have to come up with some way of saying that you think that there is such a connection, that there's a baseline tendency in the population to do X, Y, and Z thing, and your biased on purpose sample is but an extreme manifestation of that. If your biased sample is just really wacky, then your research doesn't matter nearly as much. And that's something that I think a lot of qualitative research doesn't really confront head on. Also, there's a whole lot of possible bias introduced by the researcher. So this is a pretty different sort of bias. I mean, admittedly, these are different types of research. Qualitative researchers, in principle, don't have the same problem of, say, forcing people to, say, ridiculous types of things that you see in quantitative research, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad would you feel if the person closest to you in your entire life died? I mean, it's ridiculous to put that on a scale of 1 to 10. And I think most people would be psychotic if they didn't say a 10, worst possible feeling. So you don't have that problem. But on the other hand, there's all types of filtering that you have to do of your data, coding, memo writing, basically choosing to observe particular things and not observe others. And this introduces a whole lot of potential for bias. So in this way, qualitative research could in certain ways even be less collaborative than the best case quantitative research. And we've already kind of talked about this, but relatedly, this means that qualitative research oftentimes ends up being very ideographic, meaning that it's about a narrower range of phenomena than people are willing to admit. And really, when you break it down, the solutions to these things, like, for instance, making your data more comparable across different samples, requires doing some heavy compression when you code qualitatively, which sort of takes away the point. By the way, there's also this kind of somewhat ancillary issue, but ethical issues tend to come up more readily in qualitative research. Usually with quantitative research, there's very little pressure to participate. It's quite easy to mask people's identity. There's rarely the possibility, say, of you directly interfering with someone's life simply by administering a survey. But with qualitative research, all of these are much more possible, although not in every scenario. So let's now talk about some ways we might try to exploit the benefits of both strategies while avoiding the drawbacks of either. So you can think about this general project as that of mixed methods research, which attempts to integrate quantitative and qualitative methods within a single research project. Properly speaking, you might try to distinguish MMR from multi-method research, which merely combines different approaches. Now, well, these sound really similar, right? Our author here, Bryman, I think doesn't do a great job of exactly specifying what he means. I think his text is a useful introductory one, but he's very hand-wavy about certain things. And this, I think, is a case where there's some wordplay that's standing in for rigorous thought. But I do think there's something to this distinction. And I think the distinction here is whether or not you simply kind of take a qualitative approach and a quantitative approach and jam them together at the end versus trying to somehow use them in tandem, or in a, sorry, not just in tandem, but in a deeper kind of interlocked way. Of course, this is easier said than done. No one really sets out to just jam together approaches, right? So it's always, harder than it looks, but the goal would be to somehow find a way to give these things a deep linkage. So is it possible that there's, any kind of coherent argument against MMR? Like, is there any reason not to do this? And I would say that it turns out there's at least some to consider. So what about this argument, which we've come across many times? Quantitative and qualitative research are grounded in fundamentally different epistemological and ontological commitments. To answer this question, we would have to say, well, what are these allegedly different commitments? And you might say, epistemologically, we've got this interpretivist versus positivist approach. And ontologically, we've got this constructivist versus an objectivist or structuralist approach. And on this account, it does seem initially like maybe there is some kind of distinction here that can't be overcome. But I want to caution against that and remind you that we've seen pretty strong arguments in this class for the idea that there is not such a direct connection between research methods and philosophical commitments. So it seems to be the case that people can, for instance, be constructivist ontologically. They might think that social life, generally speaking, isn't characterized by these hard, imposing rules that stand above people, but instead, generally speaking, people have some amount of agency, and they might simply have questions about the association between education and income. They don't believe that someone's education magically causes their income or something like that, but they're just interested in the relationship between the two. And then you would conduct a quantitative research project for most people because that, generally speaking, answers the question, without too much trouble. So that would be one possible argument. Also, another argument would be that qualitative research oftentimes, for instance, exhibits features associated with a natural scientific model. So strongly inductive forms of ethnography could be considered forms of empiricism, which is, generally speaking, associated with a naturalistic approach to social science. So if you say, well, I'm trying to avoid all theory, I'm just going to go see what the world tells me, generally speaking, the best approach for that by far is ethnography rather than some kind of survey research, because with survey research, you have to ask questions. You have to know what you're likely to encounter. By the way, quantitative research, as we've seen, just another example of how these things might get mixed up, can and does ask people's opinions and feelings. Now, we might say that it doesn't always do that super well, but still a lot of survey research, for example, the GSS, is primarily about people's social views. And also quantitative content analysis of text and visual documents is increasingly important. It's a big part, again, of the sort of machine learning stream of research, and it's worth keeping this in mind. Okay, so now let's talk about how we might combine these things, and we'll see a concrete example of that tomorrow when we talk about one of our really fun exemplars for this week. So following Bryman, let's discuss the many possible purposes of combining methods. I'm not going to examine every single one of Bryman's possible purposes here. I'm just going to stick to those that are a bit more concrete and analytical. By the way, these aren't all sub-methods of one another, so these are just kind of different approaches that is going to look different for every project. For each, I'm going to provide some examples of what this might look like. Some of Bryman's examples are needlessly messy, or they're kind of meta, so he likes to write a lot about research about social science research, which is, as people are probably sick of me pointing out in this class, is something that's kind of a pet peeve of mine. A lot of social scientists get really into writing about higher education or the actual world of sociology, etc., which I find somewhat irritating. This book is very nice in many ways, but one reason I'm printing some chapters and we're not just using it as a textbook overall is that this is a major flaw of it. Okay, but anyways, let's talk about what's good about the book. So one of the first approaches to mixed methods research, you might try what's called triangulation. What this looks like is combining methods to mutually corroborate findings. So what this might look like in practice, a focus group with some people who answered a questionnaire is used to confirm that researchers and subjects were on the same page about the meaning of certain questions. And there's a really nice excerpt in the Develos chapter that we read about where he describes this exact process, and he describes, for instance, certain problems with, there's kind of a funny and somewhat gross example, where in certain parts of the Deep South, there was a phrase that researchers used in the context of asking about gastrointestinal pain generally that was associated with the idea of pain in this area, but actually referred specifically to venereal disease. And the researchers just simply didn't realize this until they looked at some of the responses. They thought, wow, that's really wacky. And then they convened some people that lived in these areas and figured out, oh, they're misunderstanding what we mean, or we're miscommunicating. So that's what triangulation might look like. You could also think about the approach of offset. This is where you use different approaches to sort of compensate for the deficiencies in the other, rather than sort of cross-checking. So what this might look like, a qualitative component to a research project might be used to capture questions about subjects' emotional responses, while a questionnaire is used to obtain information on income and grade level. So things that can be done efficiently without too much hassle, we use the survey response for, and then the interview component is used to capture deeper ideas. Here, the exact format of gathering data doesn't matter. It's really more about how the data are represented by a researcher. So you could do this, for instance, simply by doing interviews for the entire thing. But for some types of responses, you'll say, well, how much information am I really missing if I convert what this person told me their income is to a number? Probably almost nothing, versus trying to convert their feelings to a number where you might be missing quite a lot. Finally, our last discussion of a particular approach here. Again, I said this wouldn't be an exhaustive one. We could also think about the unexpected results paradigm. So in the unexpected results paradigm, strange patterns that are obtained through one method are explained with recourse to the other. What this might look like would be something like this. We have income and self-reported happiness, which are generally linearly associated before a certain level of income is reached, but then the pattern breaks down. So to explain that, we might interview people who experience significant personal upward mobility. So we have a pattern that might be hard to spot without large N quantitative data, but then once we spot that weird pattern, we want to talk to people about it. Or qualitative researchers might notice an unexpected lack of relationship between class and voting propensity in a particular community, and then they check the GSS or the ANES to see whether this is an anomaly. So this would be an example where, again, we kind of need that broad pattern data to confirm that what we're observing actually is some anomaly, but then to do further research, we sort of spot check it. And this is, again, a little bit like triangulation, except here we're not thinking about sort of the basic integrity of a finding, but rather we're saying, okay, this seems like this is probably worth taking at face value, right? If you ask people about income or their class and whether they voted, that's pretty straightforward. But then you might say, well, this still surprises me, so I have to go check it out. Okay, so I think that is a nice little tour of some of the basics of qualitative and quantitative research, and then how mixed methods research approaches those two and seeks to combine their best features. We'll look at an interesting example in class tomorrow. Thanks everyone for watching.